Good afternoon. I'm Ron Zimmer, Director of the Martin School of Public Policy and Administration, and I want to welcome you to the Ford Lecture. I think it's going to be a fun event. I've already had a lot of fun talking in the green room with the people that are going to be speaking later today, and I think you'll enjoy it as well. This event is organized by the faculty and staff of the Martin School in cooperation with the Board of Visitors. This year, we're pleased to recognize co-sponsors, Commerce Lexington, UK's Executive Vice President for Finance and Administration, and the national law firm of Dinsmore and Shaw. I want to give a special thanks to Bob Quick, the President and CEO of Commerce Lexington, and Mindy Barfield, partner of Dinsmore and Shaw. Both were instrumental in securing sponsorship at the respective organization. Before I introduce Provost Blackwell to introduce today's speaker, I'd like to offer some background regarding today's event. The Ford Lecture is hosted by the Martin School, which is a program consistently ranked in the top 25 of public policy programs in the United States. We also have a specialty in public finance and budgeting, which is traditionally ranked in the top 5 in the nation, and we're quite proud of these programs. We offer master's and degrees in public policy, public administration, and financial management, as well as a PhD in public policy. And we are especially proud of all of these programs. The Ford Lecture is named for Wendell H. Ford, Governor of the Commonwealth from 1971 to 1974, and member of the United States Senate from 1974 through 1998. Wendell Ford also served as Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky from 1967 to 1971, and remains the only person in Kentucky history to be successfully elected to Lieutenant Governor, in the United States Senate. At the time of his retirement, he was the longest serving U.S. Senator in Kentucky's history. I might also note that in his retirement, he was very active with the Martin School, working with Professor Gina Toma and serving on the Board of Visitors before passing away in 2015 at the age of 90. We're especially pleased to have several members of his family with us today, including Senator Ford's son, Steve, and his wife, Sarah, Senator Ford's grandsons, Morgan, Neil, Clay, along with Clay's wife, Diane, and Senator Ford's granddaughter, Betsy Dexter. Could you guys stand so we could recognize you? We also have over 50 high school students that are part of the Wendell Ford Center from Owensboro in attendance today. Is it possible that they could stand too? Let's see. Thank you. I got to meet with them earlier today, and it was a breath of fresh air. The program is focused on civility and compromise, developing these skills among these students, and it's something I think we desperately need in the public square these days, and so we're happy to have them here today. Today's Ford Lecture is the 5th in a series that began in 2014 with U.S. Senator Alan Simpson was our first speaker. Other previous speakers included John Meacham, a former editor of Newsweek, former Kentucky Congressman Ron Mazzoli, and former U.S. Senator Tom Daschle. As you can see from this quick history, that the Ford Lecture has become a signature event for the University of Kentucky and the Martin School. We are confident that the event will continue to be an important, informative, and stimulating program for UK and the greater Kentucky community. Now, it is my privilege to introduce Provost of the University of Kentucky, Dr. David Blackwell. Before being appointed as Provost in January 2018, Dr. Blackwell served as Professor of Finance and Dean of the Gatton College of Business and Economics at the University of Kentucky from 2012 to 2018. And if you were on campus at that time, you probably noticed a lot of construction on that side of campus that Dr. Blackwell was instrumental in raising the funds for, and he oversaw a transformation of the business school. And really, the business school has become a centerpiece of the University of Kentucky's campus, and we're quite proud of the building. On a personal note, I've always enjoyed my interaction with Provost Blackwell and found him to be a strong supporter of the Martin School. Please help me welcome to the podium the Provost of University of Kentucky, Dr. David Blackwell.
Thank you very much, Ron, and welcome everyone, colleagues, guests, friends of the university. Thank you for honoring us with your presence today. It is a very special privilege to welcome the Honorable Bill Bradley to the University of Kentucky campus. We could not have found a more fitting or timely speaker for this year's Wendell H. Ford Public Policy Lecture. Back in 1995, Senator Bradley wrote a book called Life on the Run. It was meant to be a snapshot of life as a professional basketball player. Little could he realize that 23 years later, on October 16th, 2018, someone would be using those very same words to introduce him in describing a life of incredible achievement in many diverse and challenging ways. Here is a partial list. An All-American basketball player at Princeton, where he earned an undergraduate degree in history. Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. Olympic gold medalist in 1964. Professional basketball player with the New York Knicks from 1967 to 1977, and a member of 2 NBA championship teams. And U.S. Senator from New Jersey from 1979 through 1997, where he served with Wendell Ford. And candidate for the Democratic nomination for president in 2000. He is presently managing director of Allen & Company, LLC, and the host of American Voices, a weekly show on Sirius XM satellite radio that features stories about everyday Americans. His resume doesn't end there. Here are 3 other facts about Senator Bradley worth sharing. First, this is not his first time on UK's campus. Back in December 1963, wearing number 42 in the orange and black colors of Princeton, he set the single-game scoring record for the University of Kentucky Invitational Tournament with 47 points in a game against Wisconsin. Back in December 1963, by the way, it wasn't the only record he set that night. He also took the most shots. 37 of any player in the tournament's history. But as Coach Cal would say, you don't shoot, you don't score, right, Senator? Let the record show that of those 37 shots, he made 18, just under 50%. That's very impressive. Second, you should know that he is the accomplished author of 7 books on American politics, culture, and the economy. 3-time present, time past. The New American Story, Values of the Game, were all New York Times bestsellers. His latest book is titled We Can Do Better. Presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin called it an indispensable guide for those who care about the renewal of our country and the revitalization of our politics. Third, and this is one of the many reasons his visit today is so timely, is that he was front and center in the news last May when the Supreme Court struck down a 1992 law that effectively banned commercial sports betting in most states. Senator Bradley was the lead sponsor of this legislation, helping guide its passage through Congress into law. Senator Bradley is extremely knowledgeable and has strong feelings on sports gambling as well as many other major issues of the day, sports and otherwise. And he has never been shy about speaking his mind about any of them. We've invited him today to talk about the subject, sports, politics, and public policy. What happens when they intersect? I know he will have a lot to say about this subject and more about a lot of other topics as well. Please join me in welcoming Senator Bill Bradley, our fall 2018 Wendell Ford Public Policy featured speaker.
Good job. No, fine. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Provost Blackwell and Director Zimmer. It's great to be on the UK campus in this new facility. Mike Ruling, who was Senator Ford's staffer, one of his great staffers, he had so many great ones. When he was driving me here today, he said, well, you know, I don't know, this is a new place. And I think, oh, I hear he's going to tell me there's not going to be many people there. He said, I don't know if they're going to be, maybe there'll be 15 people. Well, thanks a lot. My title of my thing is Sports, Politics, Public Policy, and Life. Cover a broad area here. It's such an honor for me to be here to give the Wendell Ford lecture. Steve Ford, of course, is here with Sarah, and I also want to recognize Clay and Neil and Morgan and Betsy. When you are a son, daughter-in-law, a grandchild of someone who was beloved by people, it's always a wonderful thing. And I just want to tell all of you, as you know, that your father and grandfather was a beloved public servant in Kentucky and deeply respected in the United States Senate. I remember when I decided to run, I was actually playing basketball, and I went to see Senator Ford. He was the head of the Senate campaign committee. And I sat down. I was nervous. He's the first senator that I will have talked with. And I sit down, and the first thing he says is, "Why does a basketball player ever think he can be a senator?" I said, okay. But he proved to be a staunch supporter in my first campaign in the campaign committee. And then I remember in 1979 or 80, I was recalling with Mike Ruling that I came down to campaign for him. I think we were in Louisville, Freedom Hall or something like that. And he and Mrs. Ford actually presented me with probably one of the nicest gifts that anybody had ever been given. And I would say in pretty much my political career, of course it has a context. And that was at the time our daughter was 3 years old. And he gave me a rocking chair made in Kentucky for our 3-year-old daughter. Still have it. And Senator Ford, though, he was tough in defense of his state. Tobacco was one of the products in Kentucky. He was a staunch defender of tobacco. I didn't think it was such a good idea, and so I was an opponent of tobacco. And I got pretty close to beating him a couple of times, but never really quite succeeded. And then I was going at it for a while, and my chief of staff comes in and says, "What's this from the Rules Committee?" And Senator Ford was in charge of the Rules Committee, which had jurisdiction over the administration of the Senate, including the room space. And my chief of staff said, "We just lost a room." I see. Okay, I got the message. Yeah. So I'm so pleased to be here again at the University of Kentucky, not only UKIT, but I don't think many people know this. When I was in high school, I grew up in a little town in Missouri, about 3,500 people on the banks of the Mississippi River. And my father was the local banker. And one day he came home and said, "I had a visitor today. This guy came in the office and he said, my secretary came in and told me his name. I didn't know who he was. And so I made him wait 2 hours before I could get around to meeting him." And I said, "Well, what was his name?" He said, "Adolph Rupp." So my father didn't know anything about basketball, I'll tell you. So when I think of sports, I think of sports and values. And I also think of the variety of things that you experience when you are in sports. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that today, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of where we are in the country in terms of where we could be. So let me begin by telling you a story. You provost mentioned that I made my living running around in drafty arenas for about 10 years, playing basketball for the New York Knicks. And so I'll tell you a story from those years. We were in about my 3rd or 4th year, and one day I got a letter from a fan. And the letter said, "Bradley," and we'd lost to the Boston Celtics Saturday night and Sunday afternoon. The letter came on Tuesday. And the writer said, Bradley, if you lose one more game to the Boston Celtics, I'm going to come to your house and kill your dog. And the guy signed his name. Joe Pell. Maybe because he signed his name, I don't know. I wrote back to him and I said, "Dear Joe Pell, look, we don't like to lose any more than you do. We're doing the best we can. And by the way, I don't own a dog." Well, you can guess what happened. About 3 weeks later, UPS truck pulls up in front of our house, and the guy gets out. He has a big box. He puts the box down right on our front step. My wife looks outside, sees the box, comes to me and says, "Bill, what is this box out there with a dog in it?" I said, "What?" So I go out and look. Here's the box. Sure enough, dog inside. Outside of the box is an envelope. Outside of the envelope, it says, "From Joe Pell." And I open the envelope. There's a note inside. The note says, "Bradley, don't get too attached to this dog." Which I always thought was pretty good advice for a politician. You know, don't get too attached to your job. Just one other quick story. Again, the provost mentioned that I was on the Olympic basketball team back in the Paleolithic era. And so I'll just tell you one story from those days. I was selected to be on the Olympic basketball team, and so I thought, you know, the Soviet Union had the second best, the then Soviet Union had the second best basketball program in the world. And so I went to a Russian professor, always thinking of my Boy Scout, be prepared, and said, "Could you give me a few words in Russian in case I get into trouble out there in a game against the Soviets?" And he said, "Well, what do you want to know in Russian?" And I said, "Well, how about, hey, big fella, watch out." So he gives me words in Russian. Sure enough, we get to the finals of the Olympic Games. We are playing the Soviet team. My man is about 240 pounds and about 6'7". And I'm my present height and weighed about 195. About 8 minutes into the game, he cracks me with an elbow up along my upper chest, my lower neck. I momentarily lose my voice, and then I remember what the professor said. So I put on my meanest face possible, and I look him right in the eye, and I say, "Budьте осторожны," which liberally translated means, "Hey, big fella." Watch out. But a funny thing happened, because up until that moment, the Soviets had called all their plays verbally. But after that moment, since they thought I understood Russian, they stopped talking to each other. We went on, won the gold medal. You know, I think a lot about sports, politics, society. And for me, sports was always about values. I mean, you know, you started from a very early age. If you have the right teachers, the right coaches, you learn things that last a lifetime. And to me, that's the essence of sports. It's what you carry with you when you're not on the field or not on the court. It's what you've learned on the field and the court that can be applicable to anything you do in life. And I'd like to talk about just a couple of those values. You know, the first thing is passion. I mean, you have to love what you're doing if you're going to do it well. If you don't like what you're doing, you're probably not going to do it well. And I remember one night when I was with the Knicks, I went to a party in Chicago after the game. There was a guy there, and he walked up to me, and he said, "Do you really like what you're doing, playing basketball?" And I said, "Yeah, I love it more than anything I think I could be doing." And he said, "Well, I think I know how you feel." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, because when I was in college, I was in a little band. And we played, and we were really good. We were getting a lot of dates. And then I got toward the end of my senior year, and my father asked me what I was going to do. And I said, well, I think I might, you know, go pro with the band. And my father said, no, you really ought to go to law school. So I went to law school. And I said, you like the law? And he said, I do, but nothing like playing the trumpet, that's all. And so the reality is you got to care about what you do and love what you do. I think of discipline, you know. When I was 14, I heard a old pro at a camp, Ed McCauley, said to the assembled campers, remember, if you're not practicing, somebody somewhere is practicing. And if you two meet, given roughly equal ability, he's going to win. Well, that admonition of work became a credo for a life for me. You know, some might say workaholism, but others would be application of discipline to what you want to do to assure you accomplish the goal that you set for yourself. And that's true of everybody, that discipline. I mean, I played on one of my teammates was a guy named Dick Barnett, who was a really interesting and smart and kind of skeptical guy. But he grew up in Gary, Indiana. And from the time he was 14 years old, he practiced on the playgrounds in Gary, Indiana. And on the night of his senior prom, he was out on the court practicing basketball. And I said, well, he said, I could see them going into the gym for the senior prom. And I said, well, what do you think they were thinking? He said, they were thinking, out there, hear that ball? Pop, 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 pop. That's Barnett on the playground of Roosevelt High School. So you got to put in the time in terms of discipline if you're going to succeed in anything, I think. That applied to me, everything except piano. I never really got that. I put in the time, but maybe it's because my mother was sitting next to me, and when I missed the note, no, not really. Next, I would say, is selflessness. You know, we live in a world where ego gratification is, you know, seems paramount. And yet, if you look at the successful teams over time, they all realize, in basketball at least, that each player is just 1 point on a 5-pointed star. And that no one of them can be as good as all of them can be together. And this was always the case in teams that I played on. And probably the Nick championship teams back in a long time ago. They haven't won since then, unfortunately. But we didn't have the best talent, but we had the best team. And that was because we were each unselfish. We didn't care who scored or how much you scored. And each one of us was willing to take the last second shot, which means you weren't running away. I don't want to see the money's on the line. Everybody was willing to do that. And everybody knew if they, one player went for a steal, the other players helped out. And that is a kind of selflessness that I think is terribly important. And it's increasingly important in the world generally. And I think another of those values is resilience, you know. I mean, you know, we're all going to get hammered in life. And the question is, can you come back? And I remember my second year, there was a trade made, and I got a new roommate. We had roommates then. And he was a veteran named David Busher, and we played a game in Philadelphia. In the last seconds of the game, I threw a bad pass, and Philadelphia won. So I'm back in the room, and I'm got my head down, and I made him. He comes in, he says, "What's the matter with you?" And I said, "Well, I made the bad pass, and I lost the game." And he said, "Look, you can't make the mistake of today the enemy of the victory tomorrow." And I said, I get it. Okay, let's go on. Let's go to the next day. So I think of those values when I think of sports. And to me, they are incredibly important in whatever you do in your life. And I think another value is imagination. Imagination. I mean, you know, what is it that allows you to conceive of something differently than anybody else and act upon it? I mean, somebody had to think of PC, right? Or the iPhone or whatever. And there was a spark, an imagination, and you imagined something better. And to me, the best example of that in sports, of a real innovator, Bill Russell, of course, changed the way defense was played, and he made defense into offense as a player. He's the older man now. But the one that I like to point to is a guy named Dick Fosbury, who was a high jumper back in a long time ago. And when Dick Fosbury was the high jumper, the basic orthodoxy was that to high jump, you had to throw your stomach over the bar. That's the way it was done. Everybody threw their stomach over the bar. Fosbury imagined another way to do that. He thought, well, maybe I should try and throw my back over the bar first. Go up, throw my back. Oh, no, you can't do that, Dick. You can't do that. That's not going to work. Well, let me just try. And so he started winning. And in 1968, when he won the Olympic gold medal in the high jump, nobody ever after that jumped with their belly over the bar. He transformed everything because he imagined a new way to do that. That's true in politics. You have to imagine something that doesn't exist in order to bring it to life. And the last thing I'd say, and this is relevant, obviously, far beyond sports, is integrity. It's really the foundation that everything else is built on. If you don't have that, it's shaky, everything else. But if you have it, you're rock solid. And there are a lot of examples of integrity, but one that I frequently call, in terms of sports, was Larry Bird. Now, I don't know, Larry Bird was a basketball player for the Boston Celtics, for those of you that don't know. Not in the Paleolithic era, but whatever is after the Paleolithic era. And this was 1992, and he was on the Dream Team, but he was having back problems. And he really had missed much of the previous year. He didn't know if his back was going to come around. After the season, he went back to French Lick, Indiana to try to figure out how he could get his back back. And he had a provision in his contract that if he did not retire by August 15th, that his contract at $4.5 million a year would automatically be renewed for 2 additional years. So Bird comes back from French Lick and sees the president of the team and says, I'm going to retire. And Dave Gavitt, who's the president, knowing what he'd meant to Boston and what he'd meant to the Celtics, and knowing what was in the contract, said, Larry, why don't you think about that for about 3 weeks? Of course, putting him over the August 15th deadline. And Bird's eyes narrowed, and he looked at Gavitt, and he said, look, Dick, I'm not going to take the money if I know I can't play. I'm retiring. And he left $9 million on the table. Now that's integrity. So these are the things I think about in politics, in sports. These values that you learn and you hold with you for a lifetime. Obviously, your family's important. Obviously, your teachers are important. But also in sports, these are values that I learned. Maybe you can learn them playing the violin. I don't know. But I do know I learned them in sports. And, the subjects that today the panel is going to discuss, whether it's sports betting or political activism, I'm going to hold for the panel. And instead, I just want to talk a little bit about the country. People asked me recently, you know, what do I miss about not being in politics? And I really miss two things. I miss not doing public policy 24 hours a day. I love that. And I try to fill that void with writing books, like We Can All Do Better, all do better. And the second thing I miss are the people in all of their shapes and sizes and colors and genders and fears and hopes and dreams. And because when you're a politician, it all comes right to you. But I try to fill that void with a radio program that you again mentioned, Provost, and that Sarah was so kind to say she listens to. My God, you've doubled my audience. And called American Voices on Sirius XM Radio. And in American Voices, I interview people all over America. The way this occurred was a guy at Sirius, the head of Sirius, came to me in 2004, when it was Bush Kerry, and said, you know, we'd like you to do a radio show and get beyond the political spin and tell people the truth. I said, well, I could do that, and that has some appeal for me, but what I'd rather do is a program that allows people who listen to hear the kind of stories that I heard in America for 40 years on the road as a politician and a basketball player. The guy said, okay, do it. And so I've been doing it now 15 years. I've been interviewing people all over the country for 15 years, over 1,000 interviews, and there are two general types of interviews. One is with somebody that's got an unusual job. You know, public health nurse in the Aleutian Islands, a groundskeeper at Fenway Park in Boston, a farmer in Nebraska, the guy that washes New York City skyscrapers, an entrepreneur in California. And those are all interviews about the dignity of work and how self-fulfillment comes when there is dignity to work. And dignity to work really means that you love doing what you do and you do it as well as you can. As Tim Russert used to say, his father was a garbage man in Buffalo, New York, but his father always said he's the best garbage man that ever existed in Buffalo, New York. So it's not what you do, but how you do it and how you feel about it. That's what all these interviews are about, the dignity of work. The second kind of interview is about people who are doing something selfless in their community. Like the guy that shined shoes at the Pittsburgh Children's Hospital for 46 years. And out of every tip he got, he put a portion of that tip into a fund to pay for poor kids' health care. And the day I interviewed him, he put over $100,000 into that fund. Or the story of the guy in Nashville who goes to weddings and gets flowers and takes them to hospitals and gives them to people who are in the hospital. And one day he came in, and they know him because he's done this for years. And the nurse said, well, there's an elderly lady, 92, at the end of the hallway, and she is not going to live beyond a week, so maybe you ought to go there first. And so he goes down, he walks in, he has the flowers, and he starts to put, she looks, what is it? I said, well, I'm bringing you these flowers. No, not possible. I said, no, I'm bringing you these flowers. And he puts the flowers down on the table, and he notices that she has tears rolling down her cheek. And he says, what's the matter? And she said, it's the first time a man ever gave me flowers. Stories like that, you know. Or the mailman in Phoenix, Arizona, who he was on his route, and he comes to the place where he delivers the mail. There's a 12-year-old and an 11-year-old, brother and sister. They're waiting for the mail so they can devour the junk mail because they don't have anything else to read. And they don't have the money to get to the library. And so he goes on Facebook, tells the story, asks people to send books. Thousands of books arrive. And now their rooms, their apartments are full of books. That's what I call the goodness of the American people. I can go on and on. Just one last quick one. There was a woman in Chicago who had a son, 10 years old, had cancer. In the hospital, he got a lot of letters. When he came home, he got no letters. So he said to his mother one day, Mom, are they not sending me letters because they know I'm going to die? And so she started sending him letters and signing those letters, a secret pal. And one night she came into the kitchen. He was there writing on the kitchen table, looked like a note or a letter. And she tried to look, no, not for you, no. So he writes, puts it in an envelope and said, Mom, would you give this to my secret pal? And so she puts him to bed and then comes out. Now, what would you do, right? She opens the note, and there's one sentence. It says, I love you, Mom. About 2 months later, he died. She went into his closet to clean up, not the most difficult task a parent would ever have. And in the bottom of the closet, there's a shoebox in which all of his letters from his secret pal are organized chronologically. And in the bottom of that box, she finds an address book with all of the addresses of the kids that went to the Kids with Cancer camp the previous summer. So as a tribute to her son, she writes each one of them letters to buck them up like she bucked up her son, or tried to. Amazing thing happened. I got a letter, how meaningful, could you send one to my relative in Sacramento who has a child who has cancer? Could you send, thank you very much for this, could you send it to my next door neighbor whose child has cancer? And the more she did, the more she got. And so she started an organization called Love Letters. And over 10 years, she wrote over 4,000 letters to kids with cancer all across this country. That's what I call the goodness of the American people. And when we think about politics, that's the foundation. If integrity is the foundation personally, the goodness of the American people are the real foundation of politics in America today, if we allow it to take place, if we honor it. We're in a difficult time now. It's so different from when I was in the Senate, where, you actually worked across the aisle. I remember 1986, the last great immigration bill was championed by Al Simpson. Al Simpson of Wyoming, a Republican. And I know now, he and his wife came to visit me and my wife at the Jersey Shore one summer. We went to Cody, Wyoming for the rodeo and parade of July 4th the following summer. So we knew each other. We had trust. And I walked in, I had a list of 22 questions I was going to ask Al Simpson about this bill. He and I sat, I asked him 22 questions. He answered them all. 16 I agreed with, 6 I did not. But on balance, I thought that the bill moved the country forward. And so I said, you have my support. When I left the room, I did not even know what the Democratic position was. I didn't know what it was. Flash forward, the last, I should say, tax reform, the tax reform, as opposed to the recent tax reform, the tax reform bill of 1986. Ronald Reagan was president. Dan Rostenkowski was the head of the Ways and Means Committee, a Democrat. Bob Packwood, the head of the Finance Committee. When it came right down to it, Bob Packwood convened a group of 7 senators, 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats. And we went through the bill over a 2.5-week period and voted up and down in that group for it or against it. And whoever won the vote, everybody agreed to support that position. And that is why that bill passed the U.S. Senate, not on a party line vote, but 97-3. And I know we want to get on to the panel, but I just want to leave you with a thought. There is a cost to excessive partisanship. There's a cost. And let me give you a historical moment to illustrate that. Founding of the country, Washington's president, Hamilton's the Treasury Secretary, and Jefferson is the Secretary of State. Not a bad trio, right? And the issue is, who will the federal government assume the debts of the states incurred during the Revolutionary War? And Hamilton says, yes, we have to do it if we're going to make the federal government creditworthy in the world. We have to assume those debts. We can't have anything hanging over. Thomas Jefferson, no, Virginia's frugal. Virginia manages itself. Well, why should we pay for spendthrifts like South Carolina or Massachusetts? They couldn't get agreement. Finally, Washington says, get agreement. So Hamilton, ever inventive, says to Jefferson, well, what if we move the capital of the United States from New York to the banks of the Potomac? Would you then agree to have the federal government assume the debts of the states? The capital to the banks of the Potomac, Jefferson said. Yeah, Jefferson said, you got a deal. And they shook, and the federal government assumed the debts of the states, and the capital moved to the banks of the Potomac. That's not the point of this story. Flash forward about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And the issue is Napoleon. He's losing his wars in Europe, and he's losing a battle of guerrilla warfare in Haiti. He's in trouble. He needs money, and he's talking to his Secretary of State, Talleyrand. Where are we going to get money? Well, there's all this land over in the New World called Louisiana. Maybe we'll sell that. And so Jefferson, ironically, who's then president, buys Louisiana for $15 million, doubling the size of the United States, and 12 of it is borrowed money, which he could never have gotten had they not had the deal that brought the two sides together and made the United States creditworthy. And I will leave you today simply saying, what are the opportunity costs today of extreme partisanship? What's the Louisiana Purchase that's waiting for us that we won't be able to do because we won't get a compromise? What is it? How will we know? We won't know until it's too late. And so I say, have politics revert to the way it's been certainly since post-World War II. And that was collegially working together and talking together and trying to find a compromise that betters as many people as possible. And that is certainly what Wendell Ford did. Thank you very much.
At this point, we'll have the panelists come up and join Senator Bradley, along with the moderator. I just want to make a few comments while they're getting settled. One, I just want to say thank you for those words. They were inspiring, pearls of wisdom. I think things we can ponder and think about as we go forward, not only as individuals, but as a country. So I thank you so much for that. I also just want to thank, just for a moment, our Board of Visitors. The Martin School has a Board of Visitors that helps supports us in making decisions, raising funds, and so on. I want to thank that Board of Visitors. You can look on your program there on the back of them. There's a list of the people, very distinguished people, former governors, mayors, congressmen, so on. And I want to just take a moment to thank them. And I especially want to thank a few people, Ron Carson, our who is a chair of our Board of Visitors, who is a senior fellow and legislative liaison for the Council of Post-Secondary Education and previous deputy state budget director for 5 governors. I also want to thank Brad Calgill and Mike Ruling, who were very instrumental in today's talk in terms of setting up logistics. Brad Calgill was a former state budget director and a local lawyer and businessman that many of you may know. And Mike Ruling was a staffer for Governor Ford and then a speechwriter for Senator Ford in Washington. And I just want to thank them. If we could take a moment for have them to stand and thank them. Okay, sorry. We'll now get to our panel, and I'm going to introduce the moderator first, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Renee Shaw. Many of you probably know her. Ms. Shaw is the managing producer of KET's Public Affairs program and currently serves as a host of KET's Kentucky Tonight and Connections with Renee Shaw. During sessions of Kentucky's General Assembly, she produces and hosts KET's nightly legislative updates. In election season, she hosts KET's live primary and election night. I was talking to her in a green room about this, and I said that would make me really nervous to be on on for 3 hours and just have to improvise, but she said she loves it. So each to their own. And she's a native of Tennessee. We won't hold that against her. Ms. Shaw graduated from Western Kentucky University in 1994 and a bachelor degree in broadcast and journalism and government. She earned a master's degree in organization communications from Western Kentucky University in 1996 and joined KET staff in 1997. During her time at KET, Ms. Shaw has received numerous honors for her reporting and hosting. We're glad to have Ms. Shaw as a moderator today.
Pleasure. Thank you, Mr. Zimmer. It's a pleasure. And to get to Senator Bradley's points about, to your point, Mr. Zimmer, about being on television for 3 or 4 hours, it's about your passion, Senator Bradley, and to still do it with integrity and resilience certainly is required. So I'm very delighted to host this conversation about sports wagering, and we know that Kentucky is engaged in this issue. We know that there is a bipartisan group of legislators who are working on legislation that could be presented before the Kentucky General Assembly in the 2019 session that will begin in earnest in February. So joining Senator Bradley to talk about this intersection of sports and politics and public policy, particularly as it relates to sports wagering, is veteran UK football and basketball radio play-by-play, the voice of Wildcats, broadcaster Tom Leach. Round of applause. And Centre College economics professor and sports economist Bruce Johnson. So I want to pick up with you, Senator Bradley. We heard in the introduction by the provost that in May, the U.S. Supreme Court did strike down a federal law that was named the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act of 1992, affectionately known as the Bradley Act, that banned commercial sports betting in most states. The decision did not legalize sports betting. It merely cracked the door open for states to decide whether to legalize it. So I want to get your opinion about what you think of that ruling. You were quoted in The Nation as saying that it would lead to athletes being considered a roulette chip. So I want you to pick up on that point and also give us the arguments for why you were against the ruling.
Sure. This was the only legislation about sports that I did in 18 years in the Senate. I tried to run away from sports as a politician, but here it was. And I did this because I don't think athletes should be considered roulette chips. I remember I was a player with the Knicks, and we were in the final seconds of a game, and my team scored, increasing our margin from 7 to 9 points. And the crowd booed in New York. Why? Because it was more than the line. So that made me feel, there's some other aspect here. And I believe that when I did the legislation, 4 states already had sports betting. So we grandfathered those 4 states. And to give states the opportunity to do it so as to avoid the reasoning that the Supreme Court followed in order to reach this decision, we said for next year, any state can do sports betting. Any state can pass a law, and they'll be the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, the 10th. No states passed the law. So 1 year later, it went into effect, banning sports betting in 46 states. And this gets back to, what do you think sports is? You know, I think, as I said in my remarks, sports for me is establishment of values, it's competition, it's discipline, it's imagination, it's all these things. Well, but it's also business. People say, well, that's true, it is business. I remember when the 2 leagues tried to merge ABA and NBA in the early 70s, creating a monopoly like the football leagues did, thereby denying the right of players to sell their services to a free market. The players' union, Oscar Robertson, John Havlicek, I, Dave DeBuscher, others, went to Washington and made our case. And I never will forget a hearing in the Judiciary Committee on the exemption to antitrust law that the owners wanted to get. And I knew we were going pretty well when Roman Haruska, who was a Republican from Nebraska, said, I agree with what you're saying. We want a free market. We want the ability of an athlete to submit their services to the market, just like a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, right? And so we resisted that through political action. And the result was that the reserve clause was ended. The reserve clause, which bound players to teams in perpetuity, was ended. And then players could move from team to team, as they do now. Now, just parenthetically, when I came into the NBA, the average salary was $9,500. Next year, it'll be $8 million, right? So were we successful? I think so. So obviously, sports is also business. But the question is, vicarious living through sports. We all do that. You know, I wanted to be like Bob Pettit from LSU and the St. Louis Hawks. Everybody wants to be. You live vicariously through sports figures. But I think it's a step too far if we now say we're going to turn them into roulette chips and we're going to wager on them. I know the arguments that are on the other side, not Justice Alito's argument, but the arguments, well, we already have it. It is illegal out there, and you know, might as well make it good. Okay, well, you know, what should we legalize? Well, I don't want to do analogies. So, you know, there are plenty of things like that. But I just don't think that we want to carry it away. And this legislation leaves it to states to say, what will the wagering be on? Will it be on pros? Or maybe everybody wanted to wager on UK, University of Kentucky here. Or maybe, you know, there's this great high school team in Indiana that's playing a great high school team in Kentucky, and we'd like to bet on that too. Or where do we draw the line? And then there's the issue of, well, the states say, be a lot of revenue, we won't have to raise anybody's taxes. That was the arguing for casino gambling. That was the argument for lotteries. But some or other taxes still seem to go up. And so I would argue that that's not the correct way to think about this. And I would like to see us say that, you know, wagering on sports isn't really needed. Why do we need it? And by the way, who's going to get those revenues? The state? Or if it's the teams, the players, who's going to get the revenues? And and what's happened since the law has passed is now become big business. I know there are 2 pieces of legislation in the Kentucky State Legislature. So the real question is, what do you want? It's up to the people. Decide what they want. It used to be there was a small coalition against gambling. But if that's gone, well, we can gamble about everything. And I doubt that somebody's going to say, you can now gamble about, you know, high school games. But who knows? There's nothing that prohibits that from happening.
Mr. Leach, your perspective on legalization of sports wagering.
We're on a college campus, obviously, here, so curious if you foresee the passing of legislation state by state, Kentucky, wherever, as a result of this ruling, that would accelerate the call for college athletes to be compensated in some way, because this will increase the number of entities that are profiting off them when they are not, they will argue, not getting anything.
You know, I think that stretches a little bit. I'd rather have a national law. then everybody's treated the same. If you're going to do sports betting, have a national law and have it regulated by commission. And the commission makes the decision. The commissioners are appointed, like the Federal Reserve or the FTC, and they will be able to administer the law. The more money that's around sports, the more you make the argument that it should be shared with the players. I'm not sure I'd make that argument in this case, and I'm not sure doing it is worth doing in order to raise the issue of paying players.
The NCAA, in the case of basketball, they would have to make the determination about paying the student athletes, correct? When it comes down to compensation. That's not something
That's
that the
beyond
states-
my pay grade. I don't know.
Mr. Johnson, do you know if that's correct, that a Kentucky law wouldn't necessarily answer the idea or the question of student-athlete compensation?
No, that's not a matter of state law, it's a matter of NCAA policy. It may, however, soon be a matter of law, national policy, because there is a court case, a lawsuit going through federal court now. The trial is scheduled to begin in December, and it is a case being brought by a former college football player from Clemson, a defensive back who graduated a few years ago and plays in the NFL now, and a forward for the Sacramento Kings, a former college player, and they are suing the NCAA in federal court under the Sherman Antitrust Act, which says that any combination or conspiracy and restraint of trade is illegal. And it really, not any more words than that, really. And they argue the NCAA is a conspiracy and restraint of trade, and the players should be able to sell their services in a free market. Now, interestingly, there have been several other antitrust cases involving the NCAA. There was one, the big football powers didn't like the way the NCAA was handling TV contracts back in the 1980s. They sued the NCAA and said, the NCAA shouldn't be telling us how many games can be shown on TV. We want to show more games, and we want more of the games to be the big football powers. And they won. The NCAA lost that antitrust suit, and we have the environment we have now, which on weekends and increasingly during the week, you can turn on ESPN, ESPNU, and have your pick of college football games and college basketball games, and the fans love it. And there have been two other cases. Assistant basketball coaches brought their suit because there was a restriction on how much you could pay the third basketball coach. And the Ed O'Bannon case on this, which was settled, which was decided a few years ago, in which Ed O'Bannon, the former NCAA Player of the Year for UCLA on their 1995 national championship team, and several other former players sued the NCAA because they discovered many years after they were playing that their images and likenesses were being used on video games. They had no idea, and they weren't getting any money from that. They were no longer even players. They weren't able to get royalties. They sued, and the NCAA lost that one. So that they've not got a good track record in antitrust cases. The federal judge hearing the current case, whose lawyer won true free agency for the NFL about 15 years ago, the judge hearing that case is the one who ruled against the NCAA in the Ed O'Bannon case. And this could, it might not go to court, it might not go to trial. There's always a possibility the NCAA might come to some sort of settlement. I haven't seen any evidence that it might happen, but, or it could go all the way to the end, and who knows? It would be a completely different environment.
Mr. Leach, sports wagering would be a big boon for ESPN and the other host of cable sports networks. Can you comment on that and what your thoughts are about whether the next part of that conversation should be about student-athlete compensation? And if you're going to pay coaches seven-figure salaries, there's an argument that people aren't there to see the coaches, they're there to see the players. And should there be some kind of compensation for that?
Yeah, well, that contention's been around for a long time, and I don't think it's going to go away because the money keeps getting bigger, and networks will benefit because of sports wagering, because you see them talking about it more and more already in every sport. But the casino companies and the people orchestrating the wagering will no doubt benefit the most from this. And I'm wondering, from what your remarks, Senator, that I would assume the Jeffersonian position would be if the people want this, then so be it. The Hamiltonian position would be to try to find a way to protect the institutions that we're dealing with in this particular case. Is there a way to craft a national policy or legislation to better govern this if we're going into these new waters?
I'm not sure Hamilton or Jefferson would have a position on sports betting.
Well, they're in politics, they'd have to take one, I guess.
But, sure, I mean, if you're going to do this, you can pass, as I said, you can pass a national law, set it out what you want. But, let's see, do the people really want this? Or is it the interest who will benefit from the sports betting who want it? And so this was not a subject that I spent my entire career doing. This was something I did on spur of the moment because I care about this game and thought that it would be debauched if it had sports betting generally in the society. And I appreciate what you said, Bruce, about all the lawsuits and so forth. And I'm a kind of older guy now, so I can tell you what, I think there are too many lawsuits, generally, right? It used to be that issues were resolved by norms, right? You behaved a certain way, your community made sure it worked and so forth. And now, anything that happens, you have to go to the court to get it done. So you're essentially abdicating your responsibility as an individual, as a community, and ultimately as a legislature, and leaving it to the courts. And I think that's not the most democratic way, and in the long run, not probably the greatest advantage to the country in the long term.
We would like to invite you all to ask some questions if you have some, and so we have some folks who will be stationed to bring the mic to you. Or you can go to the mic, however. So we'd love to have you engaged in the conversation. Mr. Johnson, there's a lot of questions that Kentucky lawmakers will need to answer, whether to tax a share of how much people bet, how much betting operators generate in revenue after they pay out to the winners, whether the new sports betting industry would be overseen by an existing agency or by a new one, and where would they be allowed to place their bets, at existing gambling facilities, online, or even at convenience stores. So can you offer any kind of insight on what legislators should be thinking about as they answer those questions?
Well, I think Kentucky can benefit from looking to see what the early movers have done. And so in New Jersey, for instance, which already has sports gambling in place, they've been operating for several months. You can do it by app there, and and in casinos and maybe other places too. But there's going to be a lot of experimentation. I think Churchill Downs has a big interest in this, and they've got a powerful lobby, and they've got facilities to do this. They also can do this online because they've got casinos and they're set up, and they've got the TVG. Or the Twin Spires, rather, for betting online with horse races. So they know how to do that. And it's just going to depend on what the legislators think would be best for Kentucky. But I would be surprised if pretty soon, in the next couple of years, we don't have legalize sports betting. It's sort of free money for the state, and from the legislators' standpoint, it's revenue that they can get without raising taxes. It's not going to be a huge bonanza, but still free money, and people do like to bet on sports.
You know, if you want to look at the early movers, you don't have to look at New Jersey. I mean, there are 4 states that have had it for 40 years.
Right.
What's their experience? Were all of their deficits ended? I mean, did you fund the whole state government in Delaware by sports betting? I don't think so. Yeah, everything adds a little bit of money to the till. But the question is the little money you add to the till worth what you lose potentially from the sport and the values that are taught through the sport? If everything is simply a matter of commerce, I've always felt sports is a little more than a matter of commerce. Sure, people are paid, there are pros, I was one, but it's a little more than that. And, you know, you go to the betting parlors in London, they don't quite have a really warm attitude toward their players. You know, they're just betting. And I don't know. I think that, again, this is a democracy will decide this, but I think it's short-sighted in the long run. I mean, who knows? I mean, will there be an Alex Groza and Ralph Beard because of the passage of this law? I don't know. Possible. You don't know what things are going to be going because nothing has been done. Nobody has written a law saying that this can happen. So we'll see.
Yes, in the audience, Professor.
I guess I'd like to push you a little, Senator Bradley, on the comment you made about London, because of course
You're from London?
What?
Are you from London?
No, I'm not.
Have you bet in London?
Yes, I
Did
have.
you make a lot of money?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
But it is gambling has long been legal in the United Kingdom, and it does seem that many people are very passionate about their local teams. The structure's a lot different because there's no athletics associated with universities or colleges there, so it is primarily professional. But it does seem to have been a fairly successful enterprise. It's not saying there are no issues, but I'd like some thoughts and comments from the panel about operate successfully in London or in the United Kingdom. What's different about us that means it's not going to be successful?
I thought the answer was,
I mean,
I don't know.
the question, how do you define success? The amount of revenue that's generated, the pressure it builds to pay players in college and therefore pervert the educational system even more? Or how do you measure success? What are you talking about? The additional thrill you get, being able to go in and bet on UK basketball as opposed to the horse race at Churchill Downs? I mean, how do you define it?
yeah. So if I could speak to that, sports betting is all over Europe. It's in Australia, it's in Mexico, and we don't have much evidence of match fixing or point shaving in those leagues, which is not to say that it doesn't happen, but the teams take a very different attitude. The leagues take a very different attitude toward there than they do here. Officially, the professional sports leagues and the NCAA are against legalized sports gambling. Now that it's going to happen, they want to try to get a piece of the action. But in the English Premier League, the top level of soccer in the UK, there are 17 out of the 24 Premier League teams which have bookmakers ads on their jerseys. And you can place bets from kiosks in the stadiums during the games. I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but it's pretty clear that people really like to bet on sports, and betting on them seems to enhance their pleasure. I know people who make an annual trip to Las Vegas, and one of the things they like to do there, it's before the basketball season starts, they like to place a bet on the Wildcats to win the NCAA championship, no matter whether the Wildcats have any chance that year or not. It makes them feel like they're with the Cats. And if they do win, well, I was there at the beginning, and so that's.
We have another question, I think, up here, and then we have a question right here. And yes.
Thank you, Senator Bradley. I also want to thank Dr. Johnson and Mr. Leach for their attendance. You've all spoken so much about the role that public policy and politics plays in our sports. I wanted to ask you by chance, what role do you think sports should play in our public policy and in our politics?
Well, are you referring to anything specifically?
Not necessarily. I just wanted to see what you would.
Well, I think the
suppose.
values that I described should play a role in our politics, for sure. I mean, we don't have enough of those 4 or 5 values. The question occasionally comes up about athletes' political activism. That's what I thought your question might refer to. The Colin Kaepernick thing of taking the knee and so forth. I think the point there is because somebody's an athlete doesn't mean they shouldn't have political views or express them the way they choose to, as long as they're not violent. And I think and this isn't new. I mean, you talk to Bill Russell. Bill Russell and the Boston Celtics played a game right here in Kentucky in the 1960s in Frank Ramsey's hometown. Is that Owensboro? No, I don't know where it is.
Madisonville.
Madisonville. And of course, there was no hotel for the black players. They couldn't stay with the white players. So Bill Russell, Sam Jones, K.C. Jones, went to Red Auerbach and said, we're not here, we're gone. And they left. Well, that's a political statement, right? And athletes have been making political statements forever. And another Kentuckian, Muhammad Ali, made a lot of political statements, right? Or you can find any number of people. And I think that today, one of the interesting things is how Adam Silver, the NBA, is handling this whole ecosystem of issues. He encourages players to become politically active. Become politically active. And in doing so, he says, okay, I support your political activism. The game is the game. The game is the game. Makes you more effective when you advocate politically. So my own view is the Colin Kaepernick thing, what I remember when the thing exploded, before the Nike ad, when it exploded and everybody was up in the air, how dare he. I saw a story about his home in Modesto, California. If you don't know what Modesto is, it's the Central Valley of California, extremely conservative. And it had a picture of his home. And his parents had the American flag out, meaning the country's big enough and fair enough for all opinions, and let's let 1,000 flowers bloom. And I think athletes ought to be able to have a voice too. When I was an athlete, my concern wasn't politics, but I had a problem using well-knownness for anything. So that was my own particular private issue. But I think, I remember one day DeBuscher and I marched in an anti-Vietnam parade in Cincinnati in the afternoon. Were we politically active? I don't know, probably, but we were also looking for girls.
Multitasking. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Hi. So I'm a PhD student here in the cultural anthropology department, and hopefully I can teach a race and anthropology class next semester. But my background is like yours. I used to umpire pro baseball, but now I'm hoping to get my PhD. So my question for all three of you guys is NCAA and professional sports. So if they do legalize this, it is known that a lot of minorities play in NCAA and in professional sports. So what's it to take that minorities, say in like Texas, Arizona, just go bet on themselves? Like it's known that Floyd Mayweather goes to go bet on himself before fights. So what's it to go say a player from Kentucky goes to go bet on himself because he needs some food money?
Well, there's nothing in the law that would prevent that now, but there is no law, right? So depends on what the law says. It just gives you just one little angle that you have to think about when you do something like this. I mean, the Pete Rose example of betting on his team was pretty instructive. So, Tom?
Senator Bradley's point about the fact that this is all uncharted waters now legislatively is very good because, to your question, Floyd Mayweather is an individual sport, but most of the time we're talking about team sports. But there are prop bets where you can bet on a particular event or statistic or record or whatever it might be. And so a player could theoretically wager on himself to score X number of points, but how does that affect the context of the team goals to win the game or the championship? So there's a lot of unknowns as we go down this path.
Well, the professional leagues have long banned any sort of betting by the players and the managers, so it's not a law. But you saw what happened to Pete Rose when he got caught betting on the Reds. He said he never bet against them, but that doesn't matter. He was banned for life. And if legalized betting on NCAA games comes about, the NCAA and the universities could ban the players, and then they would suffer the penalties if they tried to do that.
So let's assume there is sports betting. And I have a son who's a great player at the University of Kentucky Wildcats. Can I bet on my son? Can I take the information that I get from my son and cast a bet?
About injuries and the like?
Everything. Injuries, whatever.
Yeah, strategy.
You're opening a can of worms here that is not going to produce a good end. That is my cautionary message. But then, of course, since it's my bill, what the hell?
There's a big,
You have every right. Yes, sir. And then there's a gentleman here who needs a mic after you voice your comment, sir, right here. Yes.
I've got a question I think that would interest all of us. And one that Coach Rupp, I'm sure, asked, who was guarding Bradley that night?
Were you there?
Yeah. Yeah.
You were?
Yeah.
That's great. I can't see you, but your voice sounds very young.
Far from it. But I followed your career and wondered where you were going to school.
Right.
Was there a question
Yeah.
about where you were going to wind up?
Yeah,
And you
yeah,
went
there
to
was
the
a-
Ivy League,
Yeah.
and I'm sure made a lot of other schools
Right.
very unhappy.
I'll tell you that story if you want to, if people are interested. But you asked the question. So I had 75 basketball scholarship offers. Kentucky, Kansas, North Carolina, among them. And I narrowed it down to, I visited about 5 or 6 schools, narrowed it down to Vanderbilt, Princeton, Yale, Duke, and University of Missouri, which is where I grew up. It's my UK. and decided on Duke and signed an athletic scholarship. My father said to me, out of the blue, he'd never graduated from high school or been out of the United States, said, you ought to take a trip to Europe. So I took a trip to Europe, 13 girls on the tour, and me, not bad. And I remember walking into the quad of Christ Church College at Oxford and thinking, oh, I got to find a way to get back here. Came back to Missouri, played baseball, broke my foot, contemplated the world without sports. Is what happens whenever you're injured. You contemplate the world, what if you never play again? Started reading books, read a book about something called a Rhodes Scholarship, and discovered that Princeton had the most number of Rhodes Scholars at that moment, and the Rhodes Scholarship was back to Oxford. So the Princeton class was to convene on a Monday, and the Duke class on a Wednesday. And Friday night I came home from a date, woke my parents up and said, I want to go to Princeton. So my father called an alumnus in St. Louis who called the admissions officer. On Sunday night, I was on a plane to New Jersey and arrived on Princeton campus at 11 p.m. on Sunday. 8 a.m. the next morning, the freshman class convened. 3 days later, I was walking across the campus, and the coach at Princeton said, what are you doing here? And I said, I changed my mind. I changed my mind from Duke. And so that's my story. And that's why I ultimately decided to do that. And little did I know my father was very smart, that he'd wanted Princeton all along. My mother wanted Duke, good Methodist school. Then anyway.
I think there was a question back here, was there? And then we'll get this, our final question right down there.
Dr. Johnson, this is a question specifically for you, but I'd like to hear everyone's views on it. It could be argued that those inclined to gamble already use illegal offshore accounts or...
Would you speak a little louder?
Can you put the microphone a little closer to your mouth, please, sir?
It could be argued that those inclined to gamble already use illegal offshore accounts or overseas betting books. Should sports gambling be legalized and taxes cutting into winnings, why would they leave these books? And do you see these gray or black markets continuing?
That's a good question. It's not just offshore. There's a lot of illegal betting in the United States. Estimates vary from 100 billion to 500 billion a year. Probably it's somewhere 150, 200 billion. Nobody really knows. And so we're sort of talking about this as if there is no sports betting. There has been no sports betting, but now there's going to be. The illegal bookmakers don't have a very powerful lobby, they've lost that battle, and so I don't see much. I don't think that they're going to stop this from happening. It looks like, so people are saying that there are about 6 states that probably won't go for some sort of sports gambling over the next 5 or 6 years. By the end of 5 or 6 years, there will be 6 states that won't do it. And so it's going to happen. It's going to be legal. It's where it's not going to be legal, there's still going to be illegal sports betting. The pro-legalizers would say, well, at least we'll get some tax revenue. As far as the integrity of the game goes, I know that's, I agree with the senator wholeheartedly that should really be protected. You could argue that if it's legal, it's going to be easier to police because we can, it's going to take some regulation probably at the federal level to ensure that bookmakers in all the different states share data so that people can monitor that, look for suspicious patterns. We can't do any of that now because we don't have the data. If you bring the data forward, you can go to jail. So that's...
Tom, you go ahead and I'll finish.
I would assume, I mean, with thoroughbred racing now, there are offshore ways to wager. And the people who bet the most will likely seek the best deal, so they may pursue that if sports betting becomes legal. But I would think the majority of the people will take the path of least resistance, and they'll do it. That's the easiest, most comfortable, most safe way, which will probably be off their phone or going to, here in our case, over to the Red Mile or something and placing a sports wager. Right, New Jersey is at Monmouth Park.
And that's before we get to Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all the other cryptocurrencies,
Lord knows what new
which of
technology
course will
comes.
be another dimension to this whole problem. I'll tell you, Bruce, the day the federal government passes such laws to regulate gambling is the day that I will give you and your wife a dinner anywhere in Lexington. And I'm a pretty tight guy.
All right.
So I just want to say one last thing. You know, sports betting, I know, was the subject of this, but, you know, we all are Americans. And to me, the major issue without anything come close is the fact that in 2016, there were 100 million Americans who did not vote, who were over 18. 50 million registered, 50 million not registered. And then on top of that, in some places, there are voter suppression efforts. So the reality here is, if we're going to be able to lead the world by the power of our example of a pluralistic democracy with a growing economy, it takes more people to higher economic ground, then we're going to have to respect the democracy part of it and participate in the democracy part of it and facilitate the participation in the democracy part of it. Voting should not be made more difficult. It should be made easier, because that is the only way that we'll know what the people want.
Final question. Yes, sir, you can make your comments.
Senator, thank you for coming. How are you?
Hi.
I'm awfully glad to see you in Kentucky. But the one word that we didn't hear tonight was leadership, which I think is embedded in a lot of the things you said. And my recollection of what you did in 1986 with the tax law was an example of leadership that I cite often. And if you would address the leadership thing specifically, I'd really appreciate it.
Well, there are four kinds of leaders. Leader people hate, leader people love, leader people feel, leader people didn't even know he was a leader, right? On the tax reform thing, I was the fourth, right? But I think, yeah, leadership is key, so is followership, and so is motivating people by their better angels, in my opinion. It is easy to motivate people negatively. And that's always in politics. You do a negative ad, you don't do a negative ad, right? And it's easy to do the negative. It's hard to do the positive. It's hard to have the imagination to draw a picture of a world that everyone would like to be in and have the steps that we can get there in a harmonious way as one people. And to me, that's what leadership entails. And it's not simply the grand orator. It's somebody like Wendell that can count the votes, that knows where the votes are, that knows how to call Tom and what Tom really wants and Joe in order to make something happen. I think of Lyndon Johnson, for example, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act, probably the most important piece of legislation in addition to the 64 Act in the country. Lyndon Johnson was a genius. I mean, a genius in knowing what to do to get somebody's vote. And he had a very clear idea of where he wanted to go. He had the imagination of where he wanted to go. And that's the kind of leadership that I think we need in the country always. And that's the kind of leadership that makes us all feel good about being American, but it also makes us feel good about our common future. A common future where people are at each other's throats is a recipe for disaster. a common future where there's a vision that includes everybody is leadership.
Those are wise words to end on, gentlemen. Mr. Leach, you have
I
one
just
quick closing
had
comment.
one follow-up on those lines. It was a great setup to one question. I was just curious about, apart from the
No.
topic of sports wagering and this panel, but you were on a Final Four team at Princeton, you were on an Olympic team, you were on 2 NBA championship teams all through sports. You worked through, as best I would recall, 4 different presidents in your time in the Senate. Is there any one individual that stood out as the best leader in the sports arena and in the political arena for you?
Well, I think Oscar Robertson was the leader of the Players Association at the time of the Robertson lawsuit that broke the reserve clause. He was tenacious, smart. He was going to, succeed. And I think he was the leader of the Players Association, which means in the sport. In politics, you said while I was in office?
Right.
Okay.
Or just not even
I
in
would
office, just your time in politics
Well, okay.
outside of that.
Well, I'd pick FDR. That'd be my first pick. Lincoln, FDR. Those are my 2 giants. Washington, Lincoln, FDR. In terms of who I think during my tenure, I think that George H.W. Bush is a totally underrated leader and president. I think history is going to be very kind to him. And I think that it will demonstrate that you can do really pretty good things and be Republican from my standpoint.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Senator Bradley. Thank you, Tom Leach. Thank you.
Before we wrap up, I just want to make a few comments. For me, this was like a kid in a candy store because I grew up a sports fan, and as a young man, I was interested in policy. And if I could pick any resume I ever would have, I think it would be Senator Bill Bradley's, the things he's achieved in his life in those 2 places. And if it wasn't that, then I would love to have been a sports broadcaster for the University of Kentucky. And that's Tom Leach. Well, I didn't work out on either one of those, so I ended up becoming a professor like Johnson. So before we go, one other thing. So yes, Bill said University of Kentucky did recruit him, and he had 75 offers, and they were so hopeful that he would get an offer that they made a uniform for him, and we dug it out of the closet. And here's the uniform that he would have worn as a University of Kentucky player. Thank you for coming.